what's up, guys? Finally, welcome back on Sports Vitamins with episode 31. I know I haven't released an episode in almost 2 months. I'm really sorry for that. But now I decided to commit to releasing one new episode every single week until the end of the basketball season. So stay tuned because big things are coming, great episodes with some great guests. Today's guest for episode 31 is Adam Petway. I had the chance to meet Adam 3 years ago in Las Vegas. I had an amazing dinner with him and Todd Wright. And Adam has an amazing experience in basketball, working with the University of Maryland, University of Arkansas, the Philadelphia 76ers, and the Washington Wizards. Currently, he is the horizontal jumps coach at Westchester University of Pennsylvania. Together with Adam, we discussed some great topics such as how to deliver information to the coaching staff, how to improve economy, and how to assess acceleration and deceleration. So without further ado, guys, here's the episode with Adam Petway. Adam, welcome on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Roberto. Appreciate it.
It's a huge honor to have you on. The first time we met was 3 years ago back in Vegas. We had an amazing dinner with Todd Wright and another friend of mine, Roberto. It's an amazing dinner. I always remember that dinner. It was one of those haha moments. I remember myself going back to the hotel and start taking notes about all the things that I heard that night.
Oh yeah, that was a great one. Yeah, Todd's the best, and I've been keeping up with what you've been doing. Really, impressed with all the content and material you put out. So it's an honor to be on here with you. But that was a great dinner. That was a fun night, right?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your words. So Adam, why don't we start with a little bit of a rundown on your background?
Yeah, so I started out as a coach. I've been coaching 10, 12 years now. I started at the high school level, so the youth level here domestically in America. And I pretty much coached on every level to some capacity. While my role has changed, I found that I kind of like the physical preparation on the youth level more so than like the tactical X's and O's. So from there, I went from the high school to our Division III in the NCAA, which is like the lowest division. And I was also an assistant coach and director of strength and conditioning there. And again, like I while I was recruiting, while I was helping break down film, while I was, helping run practice, I always knew I wanted to get more in the S&C performance side, more so than the tactical side. So from there, I went to George Washington University here in the US. It's more of a mid-major type school. From there, I spent 2 seasons at the University of Maryland with a guy named Kyle Tarp. Really just an unbelievable practitioner, taught me what it is to be like, a true professional. And I really value my 2 seasons there at the University of Maryland. So from there, I went to the University of Arkansas and spent a half a decade there. Power 5 school, really good resources, really good funding. And when I was on campus at the University of Arkansas, I really got into physics, biomechanics, and speed power. So track and field, the athletes there were unbelievable, probably one of the best programs in the country. In the 2016 Rio Olympics, I think we had 7 athletes qualify and 4 athletes medal in the track and field events. And those were students at the university, not like Tyson Gay, Veronica Campbell-Brown, Wallace Spearman, who I actually had a chance to coach, like multiple Olympians, Mike Conley Sr. So it just has a lineage of really good track and field. So I kind of became enamored with biomechanics over in the physics department and speed power while I was simultaneously working with men's basketball. So through that process, as you mentioned, Todd gave me a call a few years back saying, hey, I'm here with the Sixers. We're trying to build out like a biomechanics program. Would you be interested in trying to spearhead some of these projects? I said, absolutely. That kind of aligns with what I was doing with my PhD research at the time. And it was just perfect timing. My family, as far as my wife's side, they're all from Philadelphia. So made the leap from Arkansas to the 76ers, built out some really cool protocols and programs there. Last year, I spent the season with the Washington Wizards. Now I'm back in Philadelphia, and I'm working with horizontal jumpers, so triple jump, long jump at the Westchester University.
Wow, amazing background, Adam. You're the second guest that was working with the Washington Wizards.
Really? Who was the first one?
Yeah, one of the latest guests was Naveen Etiarachi.
Oh yeah, great guy. Yeah, great guy.
Yeah, it was an amazing episode.
Yeah, super positive. We never crossed paths there, but really heard great things and super positive. And he was there for like 20 years, correct? So that's usually a sign of high character and sustainability. It's such a transient environment. If you can stay somewhere for a long period of time, that usually shows some good qualities.
Adam, how smooth was the transition from being a strength coach to becoming a biomechanist?
Yeah, so for me it was natural. So using the field of biomechanics to objectively problem solve and use the scientific process to just answer questions. We were seeing a lot of like movement aberrances, and what was the ramifications of this, but also we wanted to classify like what makes the best movers in the game of basketball. What physical attributes or characteristics do the best in the world versus like elite versus sub-elite. So we kind of started bucketing and classifying certain attributes and certain tactical movements, just to see, okay, what are the best in the world doing versus what are the sub-elite youth populations. So once we started to categorize and delineate within this, it just kind of made sense. It's kind of like, as a strength coach using programming, certain guys are going to need hypertrophy, certain guys are going to need absolute strength, certain guys are going to need power development. Biomechanics is no different. It's just kind of understanding and delineating classifications of movement expression.
Gotcha. And how do you deliver the data and all the assessments that you run to the coaching staff?
Yeah, so it depends on the coach, right? So communication is key, and that's probably like your most important thing in those environments. Some coaches really want to get granular and be very detailed on like, okay, here's what the ankle's doing in relationship to the knee, here's what the relative like mean valgus moments are, et cetera, et cetera. If you're dealing with like medical versus performance versus technical versus tactical, how you deliver a message is going to be completely different versus front office or administration. So your communication skills have to be have to have range. They have to be broad in nature. But again, it goes back to what questions you're trying to answer and who you're talking to. Obviously, if you're talking to a medical person, they're going to want to identify potential risk of injury, right? If you're talking to a technical coach, they're want to know why can't this player bend his hips to get into a shot pocket, right? So going in, that's going to dictate what question you're looking for or what answer you're trying to deliver using the data or using objective metrics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So my thing is just keep the reporting very simple, so everything else can be kind of complex, right?
Yeah, sure. And how important for a strength coach or a biomechanist is to know what happens on the court in order to obtain the buy-in of the head coach and eventually also the buy-in of the players?
Everything. I think understanding the technical and tactical aspects of the game, super important. Not to say every biomechanist or strength coach has to be a coach, but like understanding ball screen situations, dribble handoffs, transitions, downing a ball screen versus going, over and hedging. These things are very important as you communicate ground reaction forces, hip abduction velocity, joint moments and sequencing of joint action. So understanding the tactical aspects of the game is really important. And I actually think there's a huge paradigm shift where a lot of biomechanists and performance coaches I talk to are actually using the game as evaluation and just kind of reverse engineering what they're seeing in a controlled environment. So I think that's kind of where it's going. But I think, you have to understand the components of what the athletes are exposed to in competition if you're going to be effective as a performance coach or as a biomechanist.
Is there a way to modify the strength and conditioning session and model it on the style of play?
Yeah, no. So I think, there's general physical preparation. And I think, your hypertrophy, strength and power development, general strength capacities, fitness. I think that's going to be consistent throughout, right? So it's like some guys will need more strength, some guys will need more endurance. I think when you get into your specific parameters, right? So for example, in a big project that we're just coming out with, we kind of looked at all tactical aspects within the game of basketball, right? We took the top 10 performers in each tactical situation, and then we took one physical attribute that's a principal component to that, right? So for example, in transition, the magnitude of horizontal ground reaction forces is a principal component in beating your opponent down the court, right? How does that change when an athlete has a basketball? What are their projection angles? What are their velocities? What are their force productions, right? So when looking at this from a specific component, like you're going to do acceleration training in basketball, right? You got to run up and down the court. But if you project too high, you're going to see certain aberrances. If you project too low, you're going to see certain aberrances. If you have, asymmetrical flight to contact times, things of that nature. So when looking at the specific details of a transition in basketball, you can get very specific with how you train that. So I think from a general standpoint, yeah, you're pretty much gonna look the same no matter what. And there's degrees of variance within that. But from a specific standpoint, you can absolutely use the game as a perceptual grid and kind of a roadmap of assessment to dictate training menu items.
Got it. Okay, you just mentioned your project. I just read an article about it, and I have some question about it. So, yeah, you said that some of the elite players, the best players in the world, have a higher economy. How do you improve economy?
I think economy is just, to me, technique, right? So it's like you're more economical relative to the tactical demands of the sport. And European football, this has been shown too through the literature, is that the best players move the least, right? And I think that's just knowing where to be on the court, right? If you look at LeBron, if you look at Kawhi, if you look at some of the best players in the world, they're just not running around out there like a chicken with their head cut off. They are very deliberate in their movement and they know when to strike and attack, right? Is it trainable? That I don't know. So we've identified that it's important, right? Economy and the technical aspects of movement in competition, offensively and defensively, very important. However, how you train that, I think that's a completely, maybe that's for the second edition of the book. I do think it's trainable to a certain degree, but it takes years of practice and there's a lot of chunking involved, where I think, the neurocognition of seeing something and knowing to evaluate it at a quick rate and then acting upon it instead of just running around first and then trying to make a decision. I do think that's a trainable menu item. However, that's that could be maybe in the second edition of the book.
Another quote that I really liked about that article is that basketball movement is the ability to create space offensively and the ability to occupy space defensively. This quote is really, really simple, but it explains basketball. It really explains basketball.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned that. That's a good pickup because that's actually the first quote in the book that we have coming out. So, after an intense film review, and this project took multiple years, Roberto. So my co-author is actually one of my best friends. He's an assistant NBA coach, like a tactical coach, right? So perfect co-author and a guy to collaborate with. And we kept on just asking ourselves, well, like, what attributes make the best athletes in the NBA? And what we came down to is just movement, right? The best players on offense can create space, right? The best players on defense can occupy space. And that all comes down to you're trying to get the best shot at the highest percentage offensively, and you're trying to force a low percentage contested shot on defense, right? So again, being able to create space on offense and occupy space on defense, principal components to the game. And again, there's a lot that goes into that, and how you create space on offense and occupy space on defense can completely individual, right? There's a lot of degrees of variance within that from player to player. But when you look at the top players in the world, right, at points per possession on offense and least points of possession on defense, there are some very distinct attributes that each athlete expresses.
Sure. A great way to occupy space and a great way to create space is through acceleration and deceleration. How do you assess acceleration and how do you assess deceleration?
Yeah, so as it relates to the book, acceleration, obviously just a net change of velocity when it's positive, deceleration, net change of velocity when it's negative, right? So you're either braking or propulsing, slowing down or speeding up, right? So how we assess that in the book is just on success within that tactical situation, right? So on offense is if they're in a ball screen pick and roll situation and they're a guard, did they project out to the rim or did they project to the perimeter to create space? And did they score on that possession, right? So essentially you're accelerating and there's kind of an undulation wave model in the best pick and roll guard. So we call it essentially they attack, they slow down and they attack again. So they accelerate, they decelerate to use the ball screen. And then once they see what space is open, whether that be on the perimeter to get an open shot that's uncontested, or if they have a direct line drive to the rim, they re-accelerate. So it's like a speed up, slow down, speed up. So that was also a very interesting movement pattern within ball screen situations. But essentially we determined success. Did they score a basket on offense? Or did they prevent their opponent from scoring a basket on defense, right? So when assessing acceleration and deceleration, there is economy and there is an efficient, but ultimately we determined our outcome measure of success. Did they score or did they prevent their opponent from scoring? But there were some very unique patterns, particularly in dribble handoffs and ball screen situations where you had to accelerate, decelerate and re-accelerate. So there was like kind of an undulation of a wavelength during that movement pattern. So very, very interesting, unique type of movements.
Yeah. You also mentioned trunk flexion. I'm really curious about it because when I was back in college, my project for my master's degree was about lateral trunk flexion during defensive movements. So I really want to know how important is the trunk flexion when it comes to playing defense and maybe playing defense full court when we have a lot of change of direction.
Yeah, so we actually saw a lot of degrees of trunk flexion on defense, particularly on the perimeter and ball screen situations. So if you were getting screened by a big as a defensive guard, you were going to laterally flex the trunk, typically trying to get over the ball screen, right? And the degrees of trunk flexion was between 15 and 17 degrees. So it was quite a bit of trunk flexion laterally. The other thing we looked at is magnitude of lateral ground reaction force, right? So like how much force were you putting into the ground to translate in the frontal plane? The other thing we looked at was just hip abduction, right? So those were the three things on defense: lateral flexion, magnitude of ground reaction force laterally, and hip abduction velocity were the three components that made a good ball screen defender, essentially. The other one, we also took all the anthropometric measures, just length. If you have a long wingspan, you're probably going to be better at defense, which makes sense, like in standing reach at the rim. But we actually found that in isolation situations and on the perimeter as well. So if you can cover and occupy space just with your hands and arms, that also was a predictor of being a good defensive player. But to your question, there was a huge lateral flexion component from the trunk, particularly in ball screen situations defensively.
Did you see any correlation between the lateral trunk flexion and the speed, the quickness of a change in direction?
No. So with our change of direction, we actually used performance metrics from the combine and looked at like lane agility and just pro shuttle run. So we took that, and that was a principal component as it relates to a lot of these perimeter defensive situations, which makes sense. Like you got to change direction to play defense. As it relates to the specific quality of trunk flexion, We actually did not run the stats on any trunk flexion qualities as it relates to change of direction. We just looked at how did the athletes perform at the combine relative to were they in the group as a top defensive player on the perimeter. So, and what it turned out being is it was correlated. If you performed better at these tests, you're more likely to be better at perimeter defense compared to the average of the NBA. But maybe again, for the next book, we could definitely look at just lateral flexion as it relates to change of direction task for sure.
Okay. Okay, let's switch gears. And I want to talk a little bit about assessing fatigue. How do you assess fatigue with all the data that you collect?
Yeah, no, that's also a very interesting. So for my thesis, we looked at just neuromuscular fluctuations throughout a competitive basketball season, and we just looked at how that correlated with match play activity profiles, right? And what we found was obviously there was an acute and chronic effect, right? So there's this idea of readiness versus preparedness. And what we did was essentially we tested on our force platform before practice, 15 minutes, right? A repeat jump test. They would practice, and then they would come in 15 minutes after practice and do the same jump test, right? Just to look at the effect size pre versus post practice, and just look at what kind of effects training had on neuromuscular outputs. What we found was early in the season, in our non-conference, we played less amount of games per week, right? So we played 1.5 games per 7 days. That was in the months of November and December. Once we hit conference play in the new year, January, February, March, we were playing 2 times per 7 games. So the density was greater per 7-day average. And what we found is looking at our jump test, it steadily declined throughout the competitive season, right? So if you're just looking month to month, non-conference to conference play, the 2 values that went down and were most effective by like neuromuscular chronic fatigue were peak force and jump height. So your absolute metrics were very stable throughout the year, but steadily declined as the season progressed, right? So it's a chronic measure of preparedness. As it relates to acute readiness, though, our temporal values of the jump were more sensitive to fatigue within that moment. So, for example, RSI, reactive strength index, or the ratio of flight time to contact time or jump height to contact time, was very sensitive from trial to trial. So, meaning when RSI went up pre to post practice or post to pre practice, there was a large effect size. The next day, they would run faster in the game, right? However, if you just took the aggregate of the whole season, it would not, it would fluctuate, but the average was stable throughout the year. Does that make sense? So if you took a snapshot of just the acute readiness, your temporal values like, okay, RSI, impulse, anything that has to do with timing of the jump was an indicator of readiness or where that athlete was in that time frame. If you want to look longitudinally and look at the preparedness, if your athlete is going up or down or trending like in a fatigue or a fresh state, using some of the absolute metrics like peak force and jump height may be your best bet. So if you're looking at jump data, very important to kind of assess, okay, is it an absolute metric or is it a temporal metric? And do I want to track readiness or preparedness? Like, where's my athlete here, like in this state? Or is our athletes trending in the right direction over time? So again, my advice or recommendations, like if you're in the off season and you say, okay, day 1 to day 80, like, is my athlete going in the right direction? You might use peak force. But if you just get one test and you want to say, okay, is my athlete ready for practice or ready for the game? Maybe using impulse or reactive strength index is more of an indicator of where the athlete is at during that time frame. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And how hard it is to have all the athletes jumping with the maximum intent before games and especially after games.
Yeah, so for that particular study, we didn't do game days just for that reason, okay. Right? It's like we didn't want to like affect them too much, so we just did training sessions: match day -1, match day -2, match day +1. And that was kind of like but no, Roberto, you're absolutely right and dead on. You don't want to get testing fatigue with the athletes. And for that exact reason, we did not test on game days during that season.
Okay. And what if one of our listeners want to assess fatigue, but his team is on a small budget?
Yeah, no, there's a couple of things. I think honestly, building relationships with athletes, subjective feedback, obviously like session RPE is a valid measure of internal load. So if you can get the athlete to report correctly, and you have that relationship, just, board scale 1 through 10 times duration of training, that's always a great way to measure fatigue. I'm actually a huge proponent of that. And there's more, you have My Jump app, and you're getting some of these apps that are more, monetarily friendly, that you could download and just collect longitudinal data and just say, hey, how high are we jumping on these days, and just start, building a framework, get a jump mat, get a Vertec. Those things are pretty cost effective, and you can get a lot of really good information from them.
Absolutely. Adam, before wrapping up, we mentioned your book for the whole episode. So your book, the title of your book is Basketball Mechanics. When is it coming out?
So it should be out here in the next couple of weeks. We got our publisher, Joseph Johnson, is from Ultimate Athlete Concepts. He published Triphasic Training, Super Training, all of Fergus Consley's books. He's actually got a book coming out with a lot of Bosco's work. Carmelo Bosco from Italy. He's done Vergashanti stuff. So it should be out in the next couple of weeks. Like I said, it's just, taking tactical situations, what are the best movers doing, and then applying the physics and biomechanics behind that. So I think it will be good for any technical tactical coach, any S&C, anybody that's really just looking to, dive deeper into sport performance, I think would benefit from this book.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to diving into it. So Adam, usually we finish off with 3 rapid fire questions, okay?
Okay.
So number 1, best city you've visited?
Florence, Italy. No question. The best city in the world.
Of course.
Yeah. Not even, my wife and I went there on a honeymoon, and it's just like, it's unbelievable how they preserved the art and the culture. The food was amazing. Wine, best in the world. Yeah. So
Can't go wrong with Italy.
You should hold a conference, and I'll come and visit for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Number 2, best book.
So that's a tough one. I guess it depends. The book that I just wrote was inspired by a guy named Jeffrey Dyson. He was a track and field coach in the UK back in the 60s, 70s. It's called The Mechanics of Athletics, and essentially he just took physics and biomechanics and applied it to sprints and jumps. And we tried to do something similar to basketball. So I would say that was really an influential book in my career.
And last one athlete you would like to work with?
One athlete. That's a good question. Current or previous?
You choose.
Man, I would have liked to, in 2009 going into Berlin, Bolt still holds the 100 and 200 records. Same event in the world champs. I would have liked to be there like 10 weeks prior just to see that process, and what that looked like.
Nice, Adam. Adam, if some of our listeners would like to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Yeah, probably email is the best. It's just my name, adampetway@gmail.com. Feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll get back to him, eventually. If I don't get back right away, I apologize, but I'll definitely respond for sure.
Okay. Thank you, Adam. It was a great episode. Thank you again for taking the time today and spending some time with us.
Hey, thanks, Roberto. Really appreciate it, man.